Today we are looking at beautiful homes. So we are going to be mostly concentrating on our lovely native bees, but of course always want to give a shout out to some of our lesser loved and known pollinators. There's some really gorgeous solitary wasps, for example, and the more I see them in my garden, the more, I really want to get to know more about them. There are some really cool flies that are bee mimics, such as the one in the lower left-hand corner. It's actually called a bee fly. It's very fuzzy, but you can see it has tiny little legs, which is not very bee-like. So that's kind of a dead giveaway. And then, of course, we also have a lot of beetles that are overlooked, and those are also great pollinators, and you may find them in your yard. If you've attended previous presentations, you may have already have seen the next two slides, but if not, and this is your first presentation, welcome. Just briefly, Nanticoke Watershed Alliance, our mission is to foster partnership and progress in conserving the natural, cultural, and recreational resources of the Nanticoke River watershed through dialogue, collaborative outreach, and education. To that end, we have several major programs, and although some of them vary from year to year depending on the funding that we have, our bedrock is our Nanticoke Creek Watchers Volunteer Water Monitoring Program. It's award-winning, has won both the Delaware and Maryland Governor's Volunteer Service Awards, and it is also Tier 2, Tier 3 under the Chesapeake Bay program, which means that our data can be used for policy and management decisions by government agencies, as well as being used for things like our annual report card, which we will be releasing to the public very, very soon. We also began, and you may have heard Sydney and I yammering about this before the presentation began, but we have also started a Nanticoke Rivergrass Watchers program, which is also a citizen science program. So we are still looking for volunteers, and if you were listening to us, we were talking about the field location where we are going to be providing hands-on Tier 2 training. Our Tier 1 training is also available on demand at YouTube. So if you're interested, please feel free to reach out and contact me. The Tier 2 field training is going to be in 2 weeks on Saturday, August 1st. We are also working with churches and with residential homeowners to put in a number of cost share plantings, from everything from tree plantings and rain gardens to designer ditches and pollinator plots. When I get to the end, I will be promoting the site visit form. The only caveat is that you have to live in the Delaware portion of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So you have to be in the Nanticoke River watershed and live in Delaware. If you live in Maryland and you are interested in conducting some sort of planting project, feel free to reach out. That might be something that we can get grant funding for. We also actually just put in with our partner Ridge to Reefs a bioreactor on Joe Layton's property down in Dorchester County. If you're familiar with Layton's Chance Winery, Joe is one of the proprietors of that. The bioreactor is designed basically to absorb runoff, and it removes nitrates from that runoff, which is a big deal since we tend to have high volumes of nitrogen in the Nanticoke River watershed and neighboring Fishing Bay, which is where Joe's property is. We're also going to be doing some pollinator plantings at a poultry farm. So in between the houses, there are swale areas, and those are going to be populated with different types of plantings. And then lastly, of course, we really encourage people to get out on the water. We have some beautiful waterways. We have a website, paddlethenanticoke.com, that lists all of the public access points that are in the Nanticoke River watershed. I encourage you to visit it if you're looking for a new and great place to kayak. So today, Native bees, who we aren't. So a lot of people think that honeybees are native bees, and they're not native to the US. So they came over back in 1640 with European colonists. Our native bees actually don't reside in hives. This is definitely a honeybee behavior. So keep in mind that most of our native bees are solitary. Only bumblebees produce honey, but they're very small amounts of honey, and it's designed, of course, to feed future generations of bees. So very small amounts, nothing like honeybees produce. So who are we talking about when we talk about native bees? Well, first of all, the United States and Canada have over 4,000 species that are native. Most of those species are actually out in the desert Southwest. Over 400 species reside in Delaware and in Maryland. They are actually able to fly earlier, so they're less fussy than honeybees, which can be very temperamental. Bumblebees and some of the early spring bees, such as some of the mining bees you may see, they actually can start flying in colder air temperatures once it gets to be 50. So generally speaking, sometime in March, gets to be 50, you're going to see bumblebee queens and mining bees and other bees that are okay in early spring temperatures starting to go out and forage. So it's really important to have food for them when that happens. Of course, wasps, butterflies, moths, beetles, hummingbirds, and bats are also native pollinators, but we're just going to be focusing on our native bees today. Of all of our pollinators, bees are the only ones that actively gather pollen from flowers. So keep that in mind. And they use the pollen, of course, to feed their young. So why bees? First of all, bees are, and especially native bees, are very efficient pollinators. They pollinate about 3/4 of the fruits, nuts, and yummy veggies that we grow in the US. And they also pollinate about 80% of flowering plants. A lot of times people are in their garden, and of course they get distracted by that beautiful spice bush swallowtail butterfly or a monarch, and people don't even pay attention to the bee. Other people are really paranoid about bees and paranoid about getting stung. As I've stated, most of these bees are solitary. And for that reason, they don't have a nest, they don't have a hive to protect, and they live a very short period of time, about 6 weeks. So they're really not looking to waste time by stinging you. So please keep that in mind. Bees are critters that you should be looking to attract to your garden and to nurture them. So bees can be present throughout the growing season. So again, anytime from early March, whenever things warm up, through sometime in November, prior to the first frost. So that varies year to year. So some years that might actually be October, but at this point, we stretch that into early November as the climate changes. And of course, to me, bee watching is awesome. It's something I do quite a bit. I take a lot of photographs of bees that are in my garden. I try to learn more about bees every season. It's like a lot of things. The more you learn, you know, the more you discover you need to learn that you don't know. So I encourage you to pay attention, not just to bees, but to all of the really incredible insects that are in your garden, and they are part of your garden. And if you grow, especially if you grow fruits and veggies, bees are such a crucial part of making sure that you are going to get a good harvest. And other insects also play critical roles, from pest control to pollination. So get to know your insects. I love this illustration on the right. It is from a fantastic free online resource that is called Bee Basics, an Introduction to Our Native Bees. And this is a really cool illustration because you can see the carpenter bee on the right and the US's smallest bee, which is Perdita minima, is on the left. So you can see the size range between different native bees. That little Perdita, you may not even notice if you were to see outside. You really have to look. Some in our area, some of the small carpenter bees, you may mistake them for flies or pretty much for flies, but for some other insect and not even realize that they're a bee because they are so small. So what can be confusing is, of course, bees versus wasps, because they are related, and a long, long time ago they split. And wasps, of course, are carnivorous. So they are out in your garden. They are taking care of unwanted pests in your garden because what they tend to do is to feed on other insects. And a lot of times they will incapacitate, especially our solitary wasp, they'll incapacitate some sort of insect, and they will take it back to where they are creating brood cells. And that insect is going to be food for their larvae as their larvae develop. So that is a critical difference. Bees are, of course, vegetarians. They don't kill any other insects in your garden. They need the pollen to provide for their young. So a lot of times you can see these really cool pollen baskets that are on their legs. Wasps do not have this because they don't carry pollen. Bees also tend to be very hairy and fuzzy, and sometimes you have to look really closely, and that's why taking photographs can really help because you can actually look at them while they are still, and that is difficult to do when you're out in the field. Flies and wasps tend to have skinnier legs, and they tend to not be hairy legs. So even that bee fly, which is a bee mimic, it may be fuzzy on its abdomen, but if you look at its legs, you can see how narrow they are, and they're not really fuzzy. There's no pollen basket there. Bees tend to have thicker legs and thick bodies. They do have 4 wings, which again, it can be difficult to see as they are moving about. They have eyes on the side of their head instead of the front. So a fly, if you look at a fly, the eyes are on the front, whereas bees and wasps, they're on the side of the head. So we're gonna talk about some of our common families of bees or genuses of bees. So first of all, bumblebees, which is a large category. You're probably very familiar with them. They're kind of, I've heard this before, they're the teddy bears of the bee world. So they're our best known wild bee. They are generalists. So some bees are specialists, and they require, just like certain butterflies require a host plant, some native bees require host plants. So they can't survive if they don't have a particular plant. Bumblebees don't fit that category. They're generalists, so they're just looking for really good sources of pollen and nectar. They are also great buzz pollinators. So if you are a tomato grower, you could ask for nothing better than to have bumblebees foraging in your garden, shaking your tomatoes and creating many little, and hopefully will become large tomatoes for you to feast upon. They are ground nesters. A lot of times they will nest in old rodent burrows. They like higher vegetation where they have some cover. So they don't want like a wide open area where anyone can just notice them going in and out. They are present most of the growing season. Again, those queens, and only the queens, overwinter. Once the soil temperature hits a certain temperature, she knows it's time for her to get up and get busy. And she leaves her nest and she begins to collect pollen and of course nectar for herself, but pollen so that she can create worker bees. So bumblebees are certainly the most similar to the type of behavior that you're familiar with when you think of a honeybee in a hive and that hive behavior. That queen, once she has created workers, she never leaves the nest again. And sometime, it's usually in late summer, she is going to die. And this is, of course, before she dies, she creates new queens and also males. And the new queens and the males leave the nest. They mate. The males die along with worker bees sometime in the autumn. And then those new queens find a suitable place where they can overwinter, again, a rodent burrow or some sort of hole in the ground where she has some coverage and protection. And she basically sleeps during the winter and rises in the spring, and the process starts all over again. The next species you are probably also familiar with, and those are the carpenter bees. And of course, some people get very frustrated with carpenter bees. They're, drilling holes in my house, that sort of thing. And of course, that can be a problem. Generally speaking, if you don't want them to drill a hole, painting it or finishing it in some way can help prevent that. I do not have a wooden house. I have vinyl siding. I can tell you that carpenter bees, they tend to drill holes in wood that is in my garden. So that's where I've seen carpenter bees. Of course, they are very large. They are really, it's quite funny to watch them as they forage because they tend to topple over vegetation, which can be, somewhat amusing as you're watching them. But they are really known for their size. Generally speaking, they do nest in wood with their sisters, and they can be problematic in that they will cut into the flower. So flowers are designed for certain types of tongues in order to fit or shapes of the bee to fit into. And the carpenter bee says, well, I can't really fit into that, but what I can do is cut a slit here into the base of the flower, and then I'll take the nectar. So when she does that, of course, she's not pollinating. She's simply nectar robbing. So that could be a problem with carpenter bees, but frankly, I find them to be quite, kind of like clumsy in a certain way and joyful to watch in my garden. And then on the other hand, you have small carpenter bees, which are very tiny. And they have a totally different nesting arrangement. They need some kind of pithy stem, like a hollow blackberry cane or raspberry cane, in order to provide brood cells. So they have a totally different type of behavior than their larger cousins. Next, we have sweat bees, and you may be familiar with them. They may land on you for your sweat. I mean, that's why they're called sweat bees. Some of them, or I should say most of them, tend to be very metallic and striking, and they may have, very beautiful greens, for example. Others may not look as you would expect, and they could be fuzzier and, look more like a typical bee. But just keep that in mind. They are mostly solitary. So it's just that one bee. She's on her own. She's got about 6 weeks to, of course, live, but to also create brood cells so that next year, the next generation is going to be able to hatch and come up and begin the process all over again. They do tend to be ground nesters, so they need some sort of open area. So if you mulch everything, that's really going to hurt bees like sweat bees or miner bees, because they need that open bare ground in order to create ground nest. Some do nest under the bark of, if you have snags or rotting logs on your property, if you have a larger property. And some of them do have semi-social structures where they tend to congregate, and so sisters would be nesting nearby. We also have a variety of other native bees, such as our longhorn bees, which the males have really long horns or antennae. Mining bees or digger bees, those bees are usually very active in the early spring, and you will see them, of course, digging holes in bare areas. If you have some bare soil on your property, that's where they would choose. And they also want, of course, sunlight. It's early spring, so they need that sun to warm them up, because they need heat in order to be able to generate the energy that they need to go about collecting pollen and nectar. There are also cuckoo bees, which can be really cool. They're just like cuckoo birds. They will observe their cousins, and then when another bee leaves her brood cell area, the cuckoo bee will infiltrate it. The cuckoo bee will lay her eggs there, and the eggs will, of course, become larvae, and that larvae actually will eat the other bee and any pollen that is provisioned. Cuckoo bees, unlike other bees, tend to, of course, they're not collecting pollen. They're letting the other bees do that work. So they tend to have narrower legs. They don't have the big pollen baskets. They're not collecting pollen on their bellies like the Megacylidae do. So that's just something to keep in mind. You may see a different looking bee that is going in and out of a nest, and that is exactly what they're doing. There are also specialist bees. So I mentioned that certain bees are specialists, and they require specific plants to be present in your landscape in order for them to be able to live there. Some examples are hibiscus bees, and there are also blueberry specific bees, and also squash bees. Some of the mining bees nest in close quarters, but they're still solitary. So their nest will be close by. You can actually get quite a few mining bee nests together, but those are all, they're all separate tunnels. They don't connect. They're not helping one another. They're just close together. So mason bees and leafcutter bees, those are the Megacylidae bees. These are our tube nesters. So if you've seen bee houses, and we'll be talking about bee houses and how to create some habitat. These are the two types of bees who use tubes. Mason bees are active in the early spring. Generally speaking, they're done by June. So you won't see any mason bees after June. Whereas leafcutter bees are the boys and girls of summer. They need temperatures to be at least 70 degrees for them to be active. Mason bees are really good for foraging and pollinating your early spring fruit trees, for example, and also your brambles if you grow things like raspberries. They do need a source of wet mud or clay to divide their brood cells. On the other hand, leafcutter bees are going to use leaf material, like their name gives it all away, just kind of like mason does for mason bees. Leafcutter is going to use natural material. I can tell you in my landscape, leafcutter bees really love my muscadine vines. And the picture of the leafcutter bee, she is actually using her very large mandibles to cut a perfect circle out of that muscadine leaf. And she's going to use that to divide her brood cells. These bees live about, again, it's about a 6-week process. Leafcutter bees usually die in late summer, so you'll see them July through, maybe early September, and then they're gone. This is not my picture, but it's really cool. It shows how bees form. So this larvae, you may be like, wow, that really looks kind of like a grub. But this is bee larva, and it's just showing the process of that bee transforming. And of course, in the end, it's in its cocoon, and it will come out a bee that may be a little bit more recognizable to you. But you can also see how that pollen packet dwindles as that larvae grows and consumes it. So if you are looking to attract native bees to your property, of course, there are certain things that bees need. First of all, of course, is food. So mostly native, and of course, the magical percentage, according to research that Doug Tallamy at University of Delaware has performed, is you really want about 70% of the vegetation in your landscape community to be native in order to support a healthy community. And that's a healthy community for everybody. So that starts with the insects, and of course that is to support your songbird population as well, and also to support us. You want good sources of pollen and nectar throughout the growing season. So again, we're talking anywhere from March through November. Those of you who attended native trees for the birds and the bees and the seas already saw some of these slides. I did add some slides for perennials as well, but this is our key. So the butterfly shows that it's a butterfly host plant. The bee shows that it's a great foraging source for bees. The bird is a food source for birds. Magnet is a pollinator magnet. The leaf with the hole means that it is a great source for leafcutter bees to get their perfect circles for their brood cells. And then there's another icon that is a green stem, and that means that that stem can be used for bee housing. You can either leave it upright in your garden, or you can actually use it to create some tubes for mason bees and for leafcutter bees. So first of all, early spring flowering trees. The red maple is a great choice, tulip poplar, and of course black cherry, which is one of the great, along with white oaks. Black cherry is a host plant for the largest number of butterfly and moth species in this area. And it is a pollinator magnet. If you don't have room for a large tree, there are also a number of shrubs that might be suitable, and those include serviceberry or shadbush, the eastern redbud, which leafcutter bees do love those leaves, and that is also a pollinator magnet. Then you also have wild plum and pussy willow as well. And you have sweet crabapple, and one of my very favorites is high bush blueberry. For early spring flowering perennials, we have field pussy toes, wild geranium, and some people, I probably complained about it once or twice myself, the common blue violet, which if you have woodland property, you probably have quite a few violets. I can tell you this spring I saw a lot of mining bees foraging on the violet. It does have use. It is a specialist bee plant of some mining bee species, as is the wild geranium. So keep those things in mind next time you may curse having too many of the common blue violets. For summer, there is a huge range of plants. There are tons of things that flower anywhere from June through August. These are three of my favorites. Joe Pye weed, which is flowering now in my yard. Is very happy in my yard, and I am happy to have it. It is a very it's a very attractive plant to a number of pollinators. It also, like I said, if you get a hollow variety like Eupatorium fistulosum, you can use those stems in order to create tube habitat for mason bees and leaf cutters and other solitary bees and wasps who require tube habitat. Also, swamp milkweed. A lot of people, of course, love the monarch. They want to attract the monarch to their yard. Swamp milkweed, if you have a moister location, is a really great plant to have in your landscape. Beautiful blooms. Generally speaking, depending on when the butterflies arrive, if the original flush of flowers and the seeds that are created from that, if they are taken out by monarchs, generally speaking, I get a second flush of flowers later on. But it's a beautiful plant. It's only about 4 to 5 feet. It does not spread as much as, say, the common milkweed, which is the one that you tend to see on the roadside. If you have a drier location, then of course the butterfly milkweed is the species that you're going to want to plant. And then also bee balm, and it is a specialist bee plant. And also it creates, again, suitable tube habitat. You can use those stems to create tubes in order to provide housing for solitary bees and wasps. And it's also gorgeous. It looks like a lavender firework going off, and a lot of bees and hummingbirds and other pollinators really enjoy bee balm. So those are just 3. Make sure you choose plants. You have a wide range for summer, so choose plants that meet your needs and what you're looking for, and whether it's a color, a specific color, specific height, whatever the case may be. You have a lot of choices in the summer. In the autumn, there are some major categories of perennials, and these plants are really in those categories. Common boneset. So all of these plants are specialist bee plants. So there are certain bees who need these types of plants in order to be present in your yard. Common boneset is one of them. Swamp sunflower is another. It definitely, I've learned if it's happy, it's going to spread quite a bit. Goldenrod and aster family. So there are many types of goldenrod. There are many types of aster. You may be familiar with New England aster, for example. That's one of my favorite aster plants. But those are great, and some of those will continue blooming all the way through November and until frost hits. So that way you're covered. So I would encourage you to look into those 2 families and to find plants, again, to meet whatever your own requirements and needs are. So now that we have the plants for the bees and we make sure that they have food from the early spring all the way through autumn, what are some of the other things that we need to put into play in our landscapes? First of all, eliminate, or at the very least, reduce and be smart with your use of chemicals in your landscape. So spraying in the evening can help our bees, but of course we have nocturnal moths who pollinate plants in the evening and all night long. So it will impact them. I highly recommend that. One of the things with learning more about insects are, of course, being able to identify those pest insects. Once you can identify them, you can figure out what you need to use specifically in order to take care of that particular problem. There is a series of products called BT, or Bacillus thuringiensis, that have very specific uses. There is one that targets caterpillars, for example. So, I mean, personally, with my tomato hornworms, for example, I just let the parasitic wasp do the job. I really don't use any sort of even BT in my landscape anymore. I have enough beneficials in the landscape to control any sorts of problems. But if you are overwhelmed and you haven't attracted all the beneficials to your yard yet, to your garden, it's important to not use broad spectrum chemicals. Something like 7 is going to kill everything. It doesn't care whether it's beneficial. It doesn't care whether it's a native bee who's trying to pollinate and trying to get food for themselves and their next generation. It simply doesn't care. It's going to wipe out all of your insects, and that is a bad thing. Insects are already struggling globally, and we need insects. Whether you like them or not, we have to have insects. They're a really crucial part of our environment. So please be smart if you do use chemical use, but I highly encourage you to create a landscape that is going to support the insects and the songbird population that you need to control pests. So 70% of our native bees are ground nesters. So they need bare soil. So if you mulch everything, and especially if you use really heavy, something like wood chips, they're not gonna, bees aren't, they're not ants. They're not able to move really heavy things. So they're not gonna have access to that soil. So, consider leaving a couple of areas that are open, that are available to the ground nesting bees that are in your yard. You can also use something lighter like shredded leaves where they can actually get through there, or pine straw, much lighter, much easier for them to be able to get into and beneath. And also you really need spaces that you allow to be wild. So if you're the type of gardener who, everything has to be trimmed and cut, that's going to really limit the types and the numbers of bees who are going to be able to thrive on your property. The other thing is having sources of wood on your property. And I know it really varies according to where you live, but if you can, leave snags up, have logs and stumps that are available to bees and to different critters. Also wooden fence posts. I have a raspberry trellis, and carpenter bees use that to nest. So those are possibilities. And then also homemade bee houses are something that you can provide for in your habitat. So if you are wanting to attract mason bees, and again, mason bees and leafcutter bees are tube nesters. So again, if you see bee houses out, and I highly recommend that you make your own, or that you're careful about what you buy and where you buy it. But mason bees need 8mm nesting tubes, and that's almost 1/3 of an inch. Whereas leafcutter bees need 6mm nesting tubes, and that's about 1/4 of an inch. There are paper straws that are actually made to just these specifications, that you can buy at, a retailer that offers paper straws. You can also use hollow stems. The picture on the right, that's actually Joe Pye weed that has been cut into segments. If you make your own tubes, and you can also use the paper straws as kind of like your prototype, so that you can make other tubes with regular paper, but you want to make sure that you have an end. So both ends should not be open. So one of those ends you need to staple, or you need to tape some sort of end to the tube. Do not use plastic for the tube. That can create a lot of moisture inside, and that creates disease problems for those larvae. An easy thing to do, and you may have seen this before, is just to take a wood block or a piece of wood that has been cut, and you can just drill holes that are, 6 to 8 millimeters in circumference. You can fill them with tubes, or you can just leave them as they are. However, if you aren't using a tube or a straw, you should not reuse those blocks from year to year. Over time, disease and also parasites can be drawn to that. So we don't want to kill the bees that we're trying to encourage to live in our yard. So that is just something to keep in mind. If you are going to reuse wood blocks, you do need to clean them every year to remove the tubes and clean. There is a great resource, crownbees.com. They actually sell a lot of bee houses and tubes and such, but they also have a lot of great information, including some YouTube videos on how you can care for your bee housing each year to make sure that it's still safe for bees to use in future years. So mason bees need wet mud again, so you need to make sure you have some kind of source of wet mud near your bee house or where you expect mason bees to set up shop. Leafcutter bees are going to need some sort of suitable vegetation, so some sort of leaf that they're going to be able to cut holes out with their mandibles. All pollinators need food, of course, for themselves, so they need nectar for themselves and they need pollen for their young. They're not going to travel a long distance. So most of these bees, they'll go about 300 feet from the nest to the food source. So make sure wherever you place your house that it is within that distance. Put it somewhere where it gets morning sun. Again, even, mason bees more so, but leafcutter bees, they like it to get warm quickly so that they can get out and get going. You want to make sure that the house is protected. So it needs to be under an eave, or you need to, when you build your bee house, make sure it has some kind of overhang. If the tubes get wet, they're not going to be viable. Solitary native wasps, so there are mason wasp and other really cool solitary native wasps. They may also use your tubes. Again, they are solitary, so they have no nest to defend. They're not looking into getting in a tussle with you. They just want to go about their business. So unless you grab them or accidentally step on them, something like that, they're not going to sting you. This is a really cool graphic that Heather Holm, who has written a couple of different bee books. She has a great book that is listed in our resources that talks about native bees and native plants. And some of the information that I've provided today has been courtesy of Heather Holm. So I really encourage you to get that book if attracting bees is something that you want to do in your landscape. And again, that'll be in resources when I send those out. But this is a great graphic. And so this is how to create habitat for stem nesting bees. So first of all, and you're probably familiar with this, but you don't want to do winter cleanup in the autumn. You need to leave those flower stalks standing. They provide good food and shelter, and also housing for different insects and also for birds. In the spring, those dead stems, you can cut back to different heights. So she recommends anywhere from 8 to 24 inches. That way you have different nest cavities, different sizes, and the female bees are going to find them and they're going to start provisioning those pithy stems. And then in summer, of course, your new growth is going to hide the stems that are present, and those bee larvae are going to continue to develop. And as we go into fall and winter, we're going to do the same thing. And then as we go into spring, the whole cycle is going to begin again. And you should get adult bees emerging from those pithy stems that are in your landscape. And you want to just follow that same process. And if you can do this, this is really kind of like a, you know, it doesn't require a lot of effort on your part, but it provides some really great habitat for the bees that may be in your landscape. So if you decide that you want to do nesting tube houses, first of all, you want to think small. So think boutique hotel and not conference center, right? So this thing on the right, it looks really cool, but that's just that's a problem waiting to happen. So you never want to attract that many bees and wasps to the same location, because you're going to attract their parasites. And also, the denser the population, the more prevalent diseases are. Again, parasites can infest reused wooden blocks, so make sure that you're not doing that. Again, you want to use paper straws, homemade tubes if you want to reuse the nesting box. You can use hardware cloth that is protruding in the front of a bee house to prevent woodpeckers and other birds from eating easily available larvae. You can also place the tubes in a mesh laundry bag to protect them during the winter, as woodpeckers won't be able to get to the bees that way either. Make sure that you try different locations. You want to make sure that you're also patient. It can take time for bees to find a bee house that is in your yard. It's a new thing. And again, you want to make sure that you have those other things in place. You want to make sure that you have plenty of food for bees from early spring to late or to autumn through early November. Again, you want to minimize non-native plants so that you can support a healthy community in your landscape. You want to have a diverse mixture of flowers. And I should also mention this, don't just plant one flower. The recommendation is that you have about a 3 by 3 foot area that is filled with a specific type of flower, so that when a bee comes, they have plenty of sources of that same type of food. So just make sure that you have more than one. It's kind of called a polka dot design. You don't want to do that. Have a couple of different plants. And it may, you know, it's probably going to take a while. It's not going to happen that first season. It's going to take a couple of seasons for things to come together. So please be patient. If you can, depending on your circumstances and your property, maintain some no-mow areas. You can create a small buffer strip. You can create a meadow if you have more area. But frankly, we all think of probably acres and acres when we think of meadows, right? It's like Little House on the Prairie or something, and it's the prairie meadow. But you don't have to have that. You can create a very small meadow that is very effective. Leave those stems in place, and also leave the leaves in place. And if you can't leave all the leaves where they fall, at least have some areas of your property that you designate as, hey, this is going to be my wilderness area, and I'm going to put the leaves in this area. And that's going to provide a lot of insects, not just bees, but butterflies, lightning bugs, all kind of cool critters. That's going to give them areas that they can overwinter in. It's very crucial to do that. If you maintain a clean and tidy landscape, you're just not going to be able to draw in and maintain the insect population that you really want in your landscape. Lastly, make sure that you spend some time out in your community, out in your garden, in your landscape. Find out who's already there. Look at what they're doing. Observe them. That'll help determine, hey, I need to add this, or hey, look, this is really cool. I already have leafcutter bees here, so maybe I want to put in that red bud. So these are all things that you can do. And I want to encourage you to remember that nesting boxes aren't magical, but your landscape is, or it certainly could be. So this year out of all years is the year that you really can spend time outside in your yard and discover all of the wonders that are just outside your door. So we have a Native Bee Resources PDF, and Sydney is going to drop that into the chat box. I'll also send out an email that has this information as well. And of course, again, if you live in the Delaware portion of the Nanticoke River watershed, you can sign up for a site visit. We're going to begin these site visits sometime in August. It'll be after our last presentation, which will be on, I believe it's July 28th, which is a Tuesday. And that's Sydney's presentation, Planting for the Future. So shortly after that, we're going to start conducting site visits so that hopefully we can get some great projects in the ground this autumn. And autumn, of course, is the perfect time to plant, whether you're talking about perennials or shrubs or trees. I recommend that you go to our site, nanticokeriver.org/site visit, and you can just fill out the site interest form there. If you live in Maryland, you're interested in doing a project, please feel free to reach out to me. We may be able to, there may be grant funding available at some point, or we may be able to work on that to put a project in play. And as I wrap up, I love this little cartoon. Look, Dad, a bee. Quick, get me a rolled up newspaper. And of course, thanks for all you do for this planet, little bee. And of course, the bee is going to love you just for letting it live and do what it's designed to do. So that concludes my presentation.